The sky over London was cloudy, and the air felt heavy with quiet tension. Outside the gates of Buckingham Palace, everything looked peaceful on the surface. But something unexpected was about to happen, something that would surprise everyone. Tourists stood with their cameras ready, watching the gates closely. They waited to catch a glimpse of something royal or historic. But today, what they saw would not be a prince or a queen. It would be a moment that none of them would forget. A black motorcade slowly rolled through the palace gates. The cars were polished and shiny, flying small flags that showed they were part of an official foreign visit. The car stopped near the grand entrance. From one of the cars stepped out a tall man in a sharp military uniform. He was Lieutenant Colonel Jackson Hayes of the United States Marine Corps. His chest was full of medals. His boots were clean. His back was straight. He had the walk and the look of a man who had seen war and had come back stronger. Hayes had served in dangerous places. Fallujah, Baghdad, Helmandon believed deeply in action, strength, and military power. He respected discipline, but he believed it had to be useful. And to him, standing still like a statue wasn't useful at all. He looked around at the beauty of the palace grounds. Everything was clean, polished, and perfect. But Hayes didn't smile. He turned to another officer beside him and said, "All this ceremony. For what? We could have done this at the Pentagon without all the drama." That officer didn't answer. Instead, his eyes moved to a red figure standing perfectly still near the palace wall. It was a royal guard sergeant. William Barrett stood at his post in full ceremonial uniform. His red tunic looked bright and sharp, and his tall bearskin hat made him look even taller. His eyes didn't move. His hands were firm on his rifle. He didn't look left, didn't look right. He stood like he had been carved from stone. Hayes stared at him. He had heard stories about the royal guards, how they stand perfectly still, how they don't speak, how they don't react to anything. To Hayes, it felt like theater, not real military work. He leaned slightly to get a better look at Barrett, almost as if he were inspecting a museum piece. "Incredible detail," he muttered. "But I wonder how that hat would do in a combat zone." Before anyone could stop him, Hayes stepped away from his group and walked straight toward the guard. Crowd noticed. A few people began to whisper. Some pulled out their phones, thinking maybe this was part of the ceremony. But it wasn't. Hayes walked slowly around the guard, looking him up and down. His words were meant to sound polite, but his tone was full of sarcasm. "This uniform, this posture. Very impressive," he said loudly. "But what happens when the enemy doesn't play dress-up?" Still, Barrett didn't move. His eyes stayed forward. His breathing was calm. He was trained to ignore everything, to be unshakable. Hayes moved in closer. Too close. "What are you waiting for, Sergeant?" he said in a firm voice. "Salute me now. That's an order." The words hung in the air. It felt like time had stopped. Tourists stopped walking. Few gasped. But Sergeant Barrett did not flinch. He didn't blink. He didn't look at Hayes. His face showed no reaction at all. And in that silent moment, the real story began. That Hayes thought was just a test of respect was about to become something far bigger, something that would shake not just him but the entire embassy. The air around Buckingham Palace had gone quiet. People were still holding their phones. Some mid-recording, others frozen in place. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. A senior American officer had just walked up to a British Royal Guard and demanded a salute. "Salute me now." "That's an order," Lieutenant Colonel Jackson Hayes had said, loud and proud. But the Guard Sergeant William Barrett did not move, not even a blink, not a twitch, not a flinch. He stood exactly as he was trained, still and silent, as if nothing had happened, and that silence felt louder than any shout. Hayes stared at him, confused at first, then annoyed. The American officer was used to quick responses. In the U.S. military, if a soldier didn't respond to a senior officer, it was seen as disrespect, disobedience, even weakness. But Barrett was not American. And this was not America. Still, Hayes didn't back off. He circled the guard again, stepping in and out of his line of sight, trying to break his focus. He spoke louder this time, almost as if performing for the crowd. "What kind of soldier are you? Are you trained to follow orders or just to pose for cameras?" Barrett remained like stone. Major Davis, another American officer, saw what was happening and quickly walked over. "Sir, we should move on," he said quietly, but Hayes waved him off. "I'm not finished." The palace tour guide, Mr. Edward Fleming, also stepped forward. His voice was calm but firm. "Lieutenant Colonel, please return to your group. The changing of the guard ceremony will begin shortly." Hayes looked around. More people were watching now. Even a few British veterans had come closer. The crowd was growing, the tension rising, but Hayes wasn't done making his point. He looked at Barrett again and said, "Back home. Our soldiers are taught to act, not freeze. We train for real war, not fancy displays." He didn't know the truth about Sergeant Barrett. Nobody had told him. Barrett wasn't just a pretty face in a red coat. He wasn't a decoration. He'd served in war zones, real ones. He had fought beside U.S. forces in secret missions. He had received the military cross for bravery in combat. His body had scars no one could see, and his silence wasn't weakness. It was control. Control that only the best soldiers could master. Captain Richard Wells, who was in charge of the Royal Guards, stood quietly nearby. Had picked Barrett for this ceremony for a reason. Barrett had proven himself in war and in peace, could stay calm under stress. He never lost focus, never let emotions take over. And now, standing still while being challenged in front of the world, Barrett was showing the true power of military discipline. Hayes didn't see it that way. Not yet. Instead, he turned to the crowd and raised his voice. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "you're looking at the difference between theater and training. This man here may look sharp, but in the Marines, we prepare for combat, not photo shoots." That was when an elderly British man stepped forward from the crowd. He wore a blue blazer covered in military medals. His voice was quiet but strong. "Young man," he said, "that soldier has more courage in his silence than you have in all your shouting." Hayes turned to him, surprised. With respect, the colonel began, but the old man didn't wait. "Respect," he said. "You talk about war like it makes you better. But real soldiers know when to speak and when to stay silent." Hayes didn't answer. The mood had changed. The crowd wasn't on his side anymore. Barrett still hadn't moved. And now his silence was speaking louder than ever. Captain Wells finally walked forward, standing beside Barrett. "Sergeant," he said calmly, "stand down." Barrett turned smoothly, took one step back, and walked away with quiet dignity. He hadn't said a single word, but he had won the moment. Hayes stood still, no longer so confident. He had come looking for a salute, but he got something else entirely. He got a lesson, and everyone watching knew it. It should have ended there. After being ignored once, after being calmly asked to step back, most officers would have moved on. Most would have understood the rules, the silence, the discipline. But Lieutenant Colonel Jackson Hayes was not like most officers. He wasn't used to being ignored in his mind. A soldier who didn't respond to a senior officer was showing disrespect or worse, weakness. That's not how things worked in the United States Marine Corps. And so, the moment he saw a second chance, he took it. The NATO delegation was watching the changing of the guard ceremony now. Tourists lined the walkways. Phones were raised. Guards moved in perfect rhythm. It was all calm, precise, impressive. But Hayes wasn't focused on the ceremony. His eyes were once again locked on Sergeant William Barrett, the same Royal Guard he had confronted earlier. Barrett had returned to his post, still and sharp. His face calm, eyes fixed straight ahead. It was like nothing had happened. That only annoyed Hayes more. Without telling anyone, Hayes slipped away from his group. His boots crunched quietly across the palace gravel. He walked toward Barrett once, again. But this time, there were even more people watching. Tourists, officers, and even palace staff noticed him moving. Some began whispering. Others raised their phones again. Hayes walked with purpose. This wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was a message. He stopped right in front of Barrett, hands behind his back, chest puffed out. "Sergeant," he said loudly, "we meet again." Barrett didn't react, not even a blink. His posture was still perfect. His rifle stayed at his side. Hayes stepped even closer. "I gave you a direct order earlier," he said, his voice clear and sharp. "A salute is basic military courtesy. Even across different armies, respect for rank is understood." He tapped the shiny silver eagle on his chest. "Lieutenant Colonel, U.S. Marine Corps. 3 tours of combat. Command experience across joint operations." "You know what that means, Sergeant?" Barrett said nothing. "It means," Hayes continued, "when I speak, you respond." Some in the crowd began to shift uncomfortably. Even a few tourists lowered their cameras. This didn't feel like a ceremony anymore. It felt like something personal and wrong. One woman in the crowd whispered, "Is he allowed to do that?" Nearby, a British officer had already started moving. Captain Richard Wells, head of the Royal Guard unit, was making his way over again, his jaw tight. Hayes ignored everything around him. He raised his voice louder, now speaking to the growing crowd. "Let me explain something about real military training. A soldier must be sharp, fast, and ready to respond at all times, not frozen in place like a statue." He turned back to Barrett. "You're not in a parade now, Sergeant. You're standing in front of a decorated combat officer. So again, I ask choir, you're not saluting?" Barrett remained still, not out of fear, not out of disrespect, but out of discipline. He had been trained for this exact moment, not just how to stand still, but how to stay calm under pressure. He had survived gunfire, roadside bombs, and chaotic combat missions. This was nothing, and still, he didn't move. Hayes leaned in so close. The tip of his nose was inches from Barrett's. "Have you ever even seen combat?" he asked in a low voice. "Or are you just here because you look good in red?" That was the final straw. A loud voice cut through the air. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, Colonel Wilson, the senior American officer, had spotted the scene from across the courtyard and marched over with full authority. "Return to the delegation." "Immediately," Wilson ordered. "Now." Hayes froze for a moment, realizing the eyes of not just the crowd, but his superiors were on him. He gave Barrett one last look. But Barrett, like before, gave nothing in return. No words, no salute, no reaction, just perfect silence. Hayes turned slowly and walked away, his boots sounding heavier than before. The crowd said nothing, but their silence spoke volumes. Captain Wells stood beside Barrett once more, quietly proud. Barrett had followed his training to the letter. He had defended his post not with weapons or words, but with restraint. The salute Hayes wanted never came. But Barrett had given the world something much stronger, a lesson in true discipline. The news spread fast. By the next morning, videos of the scene outside Buckingham Palace were already on social media. Headlines appeared on major news websites. American officer tries to order Royal Guard gets ignored Royal Guards. Silence stuns us, Colonel, and British soldiers' calm response goes viral. But inside the American embassy in London, the mood was not cheerful. Lieutenant Colonel Jackson Hayes sat alone in a private meeting room. He was no longer the confident man who had marched across the palace grounds the day before. He looked tense, his jaw tight, his hands locked on the table. Across from him sat Colonel Wilson, his direct superior. The room was quiet, the air thick with silence. Finally, Colonel Wilson spoke. "Do you understand what happened yesterday, Jackson?" Hayes gave a short nod. "I was trying to make a point about military readiness." Wilson leaned forward. "No. You crossed a line." There was no anger in his voice, only disappointment. "You embarrassed this delegation," Wilson continued. "You disrespected our hosts, okay? And worse, you tried to give an order to a soldier from another country on his own post during his official duty." Hayes looked away. Wilson didn't stop. That Royal Guard Sergeant Barrett stood still. He followed his orders. He didn't flinch. He didn't fight back. And yet, he showed more control than you did. The words hit hard. Hayes had always believed in strength, in action, in speaking up, but he had never thought that silence, true silence, could be stronger. Later that afternoon, Hayes asked for something unusual. He requested a private meeting with Sergeant Barrett. At first, the palace staff was unsure. But after some discussion, the British side agreed on one condition. The meeting would be brief and off-duty, in a neutral location with no cameras. So in a quiet military meeting room near the embassy, the two soldiers met. Barrett entered first, wearing a simple uniform, now no red coat, no tall hat. Just a man, calm and quiet. Hayes stood when Barrett entered. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Hayes walked forward and extended his hand. Barrett shook it. "I want to say something," Hayes said. "I misjudged you. I misjudged your duty." Barrett nodded but said nothing yet. Hayes took a deep breath. "I thought standing still made you weak. I thought silence meant surrender. But I saw how you held your ground. And you didn't just ignore me, you outlasted me." Barrett finally spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "Discipline means doing what you're told, Evan, when you want to react, even when you're pushed." Hayes looked at him closely. "You've seen combat?" Barrett gave a small smile, enough to know that the hardest thing sometimes is doing nothing, waiting, holding the line. Watching your brothers fight and not breaking focus. For a moment, Hayes didn't respond. Then he said softly, "You did more than hold your line. You held mine too." Barrett didn't ask what he meant, just nodded. The meeting lasted only 10 minutes. But when Hayes left that room, he wasn't the same man. He had come to London expecting to lead with strength. Instead, he had learned what real strength looked like. Calm, quiet, unshakable. The story became a quiet legend among soldiers. It was told in military academies and training centers across both the UK and the US, not to shame, has but to show how one soldier's stillness had taught a lesson in respect, control, and honor. Many years later, when Hayes retired from the military, he gave a speech at a leadership seminar. He ended with this line: "Sometimes, the strongest man in the room is not the one who speaks first, but the one who stands still, with purpose, and never moves even when the whole world is watching." He never forgot Sergeant William Barrett, and he never forgot the salute that never came, because in the end, that silence was louder than any command.